everybody. Thank you all for coming. I really appreciate seeing all these faces, known and unknown people in the crowd. So I'm very excited to have a conversation with you all. Tonight, this event is a part of the Casa's Race, Migration, Italy programming event series, which is mostly planned by me. I'm Isabella Livorni. I teach in the Department of Italian Studies here. And so I'm just going to give you a little, just a description of the event series so you get a sense of what we're doing. And then I'm going to introduce the specific event for tonight. So Race Migration Italy is a series of events sponsored by Casa Italiana Zerilli-marimò in collaboration with NYU's Department of Italian Studies. It aims to promote conversations on the intersections of race and migration in Italy and in Italian diasporic communities. So it's conceived in connection with courses that we teach in the Department of Italian Studies, and it actually revisits a previous format launched by Casa Italiana's virtual salons Discourses on Black Italia, which was held during the pandemic, by bringing together artists and scholars in order to address questions about race and racialization across Italian history and Italy's multifaceted geographies. So that's the kind of motivation of the series, and our guests today and what they make is exactly suited for the scope of this particular series through the Unlearn podcast. And I'm going to introduce Kristal and Zoe after we watch a bit of their work with the Unlearn podcast. But before that, let me introduce the Unlearn podcast. So the Unlearn series podcast, which was created by Zoe Map and produced in collaboration with Kristal Trotter's Accento World, seeks to answer the question of how do Italians of multiple backgrounds and members of the Italian diaspora consider their place in the world, their various identities, and how they relate to one another. And so each episode of this visual podcast features a series of discussions with Italians of different backgrounds on topics like racialization in Italy and abroad, emigration from Italy and immigration to Italy, Italian colonialism, and Italian fashion. And also we're going to get a nice peek of an episode on music and hip-hop specifically in the Italian context. And so we're very excited to host this event here at the Casa. Thank you so much to Loredana, who will be our respondent, and Zoe and Kristal for being here, and enjoy. Okay. I'm going to introduce our guests. And we're going to have a conversation. So first, Zoe and Kristal are going to tell us a bit about the genesis of this project. Loredana and I will respond as how it relates to kind of our research and our teaching, and then we'll have a bit of a conversation up here, and we'll open it up then to questions from the audience. But before I do that, let me read bios. So starting with Zoe here, Zoe Map is an Italian multi-award winning artist based between Italy and New York City. A producer, editor, and director, for the past 16 years, Zoe has worn many hats, from art curator, performer, to documentary filmmaker and music video director. Now, for her latest endeavor, she has taken on the role of producer of her own visual podcast series, Unlearn, in partnership with Accento World. So then on to Kristal. Kristal Trotter is an Afro-Italian writer based in North Carolina and the founder of Accento World, an online platform that focuses on Italian diaspora through a global lens. Accento World is unexpectedly unpacking our individual humanity and has become a bridge between institutions and the creatives whose content can enhance the learning experience of Italian culture in the classroom. And then we have Loredana Polezzi. Loredana Polezzi is Alphonse M. D'Amato Chair in Italian and Italian American Studies in the Department of Languages and Cultural Studies at Stony Brook University, an honorary professor of translation studies in the School of Modern Languages of Cardiff University in the UK. She is a fellow of the Learned Society of Wales and a previous president of the International Association for Translation and Intercultural Studies. Her research interests combine translation and transnational Italian studies. She has written on travel writing, colonial and post-colonial literature, translingualism, and migration. Her current work focuses on memory, mobility, and translation in transatlantic Italian cultures. So let's welcome. So Zoe and Kristal, do you want to kick us off talking a bit about the genesis of the project, what you want to kind of communicate to the audience here this evening?
Sure. Hi, good evening. So, as you said, I'm a multimedia artist coming from Italy, and coming here as an immigrant, as a woman, it was immersive, and this very multicultural landscape that New York City was really inspiring and was also challenging, and I was questioning, as usual, where do I belong, and my identity as well. And it was also a pretty, I would say, frustrating. I kept using this word in my country. That's why I moved, to US, and then here as well. So that was definitely the seed, being uncomfortable. Pushed me to dig deeper in my roots and what it means to be Italian. Because there is like different version of it. Everybody got their own. And I feel that every single one maybe is valuable and interesting. Then I read the book Il colore della Repubblica of Silvana Patriarca, and I found out that she was living in New York City. So that book really is super interesting. It's about Black kids that were born from a relationship between the soldiers of the colonies in North Africa and the kids that were born between relationships in Italy with African American soldiers. And it was like definitely something that I didn't necessarily grew up studying. In general, like colonialism is not something that we study in the Italian schools. And so like I interviewed her, and then she introduced me to Steve, and then
Shout out to Steve.
shout out to Steve Cerulli, who is a super interesting cat. And then he introduced me to Kristal, and I kept going with my research. So that's that for now.
So tanto grazie. Thanks for inviting us. I'm going to say it. You didn't say it, so I'll say it. So I really want to start out by saying that me and Zoe met for the first time in person yesterday.
Oh, wow.
After I saved it for the panel. We met for the first time yesterday. She flew in from Italy. From North Carolina, but and we've been knowing each other and working on this project for 2 years. And I think this is a testament to how deeply we care about the conversations that need to be had. And there is no blueprint for the podcast she's doing for Accento World. I created Accento World when I moved here from Italy. And again, it's probably from discomfort again, right? Because I was lost. I spoke to Italian Americans for the first time. Technically, I'm Italian American, but I knew no Italian Americans in Italy. And I was lost. I couldn't recognize the Italy they were talking about. And so I created Accento, and what helped me in doing the research was understanding that it's all diaspora. We're all Italian. We all have different experiences. And so that helped me welcome different experiences. It was a learning experience in doing this, because then you just want to know more and more and more about everyone else's experiences and all the nuances that there are. And then the challenge was, and this is when I say there's no blueprint for this, is talking about Italy in a non-stereotypical way, which is very difficult. And you really learn about stereotypes when you move out of the country and you learn about them, and you're puzzled by them. And so when I met Zoe and we talked about Accento, my project, and then Unlearn, and she told me about what she wanted to do, since I had a platform and a website, I thought it could be a great opportunity to link up. I could help give my platform to this project, so it validated it in a sense, where it wasn't just on YouTube. You know, there was a website for it, and then besides co-producing the project, there was an opportunity for an e-learning space. And so every episode has a learning companion, and our approach, and we'll probably talk about that later, but everything we do and everything I do is intersectional, everything, because everything's connected really. And I think that's something else that was missing, and what I would see in the classrooms for the first time, listening to lectures, listening to how Italian was taught in academia, there was just really this feeling of once the students learn about whatever they have to learn during the session, then they leave the room and really they don't seek this kind of interconnectedness in the real world, which is difficult, and I think that's something we need to be doing. So these are our projects. Yes, this is how everything was born, out of discomfort.
Loredana, do you want to kick off some responses, or I can if you...
Yeah, sure. I was just turning my mic back on. So first of all, thank you. Thank you for your work first. Then thank you for also inviting me here to respond to it. What you just said, how do we work in ways that are non-stereotypical? How do we deal with what we do in ways that are not stereotypical? And that, for me, is the key question, both in terms of how what you're doing relates to my research interests and also my teaching activity. And Isabella, we said we'd talk about both of those, but those two are connected. And in fact, I'll start from this. I was saying earlier, I started today, I was asked to write a short article for a zine that our students at Stony Brook University, students of Italian, are producing. And what I ended up writing about was precisely my own struggle with how to present my students, approach myself, Italy, Italian language, any notions of Italianità or of cultura italiana in ways which do not bow to those stereotypes and to something that I think it was you actually, Kristal, in the first episode, I think you were talking about the Audrey Hepburn phase, or someone was talking about the Audrey Hepburn phase of Americans imagining Italy, that image, that stereotypical image of Italy. So both as a researcher and as a teacher, one of the questions that I always have is how do you negotiate that tension between, yes, wanting to encourage people of all ages to approach Italian cultures in all their diversity and plurality, but at the same time not ending up selling them Vacanze Romane or La Dolce Vita again and again. How do you negotiate that hiatus? Now, for me, in terms of research, I want to pick up on three words that I've encountered in those fantastic episodes. I saw the first two episodes, and I've seen the trailer of the third one. But throughout, there are certain themes that return, and three in particular have very strong echoes for me. One is the fantastic discussion that you have in the first episode on the notion of imagination. And that's something that I return to again and again and again, and going back often to Antonio Gramsci and that idea that you can't have the new until you've managed to negotiate the past, but you can't build a future, you can't build a world that you cannot imagine. And Silvana Patriarca's intimation and exhortation that we have to imagine a different form of nation, a different form of belonging. We have to imagine something which is not just sending us to the past. And for me, it's so central, and it's something that I keep thinking about in terms of, for instance, how do we construct even our memory? Memory, I keep saying to my students, is a future-making practice. We remember in order to somehow justify, explain, get a sense of who we are, and very often to construct who we want to be. So that question of imagination is the first one for me. The second question, the second issue that I want to pick up is the question of affect. There's so much in these discussions, in these conversations. You'll see when you watch the whole sort of episodes. There's so much that is about desire and desirability, and what is desirable, what is not desirable, what is the gap between who we are and who we feel we should be in order to be fully accepted, in order to, and should we even comply with that? Should we make amends, in a sense? Should we try to become more desirable? Should we try to fill those gaps? What is the lack? What is it that and that feeling that whatever you do, if you don't fit into the stereotype, if you don't fit into the expectation, you'll always be lacking something. And that's something that I find again and again as I work with my students. I'll return to that in a second, that question also of desire, desirability, and on the other hand, a sense of lack and a sense of shame that comes with lack. And as I said, I wanted to get back to that when I speak about my students. The last thing is language. I am someone who deals with language and with translation all of the time. Now, the power of language, the power of naming, there was so much in that film about the power of naming and the power of self-naming, taking that upon yourself, liberating yourself from ways in which you've been named or pointed out, but at the same time also the power of exclusion that language has, because you do not speak the language, or because you speak the language with an accent, or because the language speaks you in certain ways, names you, describes you in certain ways. And for me, that's where translation becomes so vital, because I was thinking, and as I was on the train coming here, I read a book in the 1990s by Marilyn Gadios Rose where she talked about translation as stereoscopic vision, seeing two things at once. And then I read another one by André Lefebvre where he was talking about translation as a series of refractions. And so I think at the end of the first episode, the question that you posed, Zoe, is what can we do? And in a sense, what we can do is continue that dialogue through those positionalities. There's so much also in here about how Italy looks at the United States, how the United States look at Italy. How do we translate the language that may or may not allow us to understand cultural phenomena? So I think that ping-pong movement is the only way that we can continue to move forward. I said I'd say something about my students. So I want to tell you two very quick stories to give you a sense of what I meant. One is, we need your resources, we need this material, and we need to be able to place in front of our students, whatever their age. I did something for Ollie, for our old age sort of courses last Friday, getting them to see a film about Rome without Rome. They were surprised. We need to put different images of Italy, of Italian cultures, diasporic, diverse, post-colonial, in all their variety. A couple of years ago, actually more than that, I had literally just arrived in the US. I was teaching online only because of COVID. And I decided to use some photographs by a phenomenal photographer, Mario Badagliacca, who'd done a project for us. And I said to my students, here's a picture, an image of a person, 3 objects this person chose to speak about, to describe their experience of migration. All of these people were interviewed by the photographer. They're all Italians who migrated abroad, some of them in Argentina, some of them in the UK, some of them in the US. Go and imagine in your small groups. Imagine the story. Imagine a name for these people. Imagine where they are. Imagine why those objects. What's the story of those objects? They all did it. There were only a couple who really confounded them. The one who confounded them the most was the picture of a black Italian woman. Those students, themselves diverse, themselves used to diversity around them, themselves completely and utterly sort of in line with thinking inclusively and whatever else, came back and said, oh, she is actually an American student who is studying in Florence and has fallen in love with Italian culture. And it's like, I told you from the beginning that these are Italians. They could not get themselves to imagine. And they were themselves a diverse group. Now, this is not the fault of my students. That's the point. It's nothing to do with their luck. It's a point with how we are representing Italy. And then a couple of years later, in a meeting like this, with two phenomenal artists, well, three phenomenal artists, two writers, two visual artists and a writer, one from Australia, an Italian-Australian artist, two Italian-Americans. At a certain point, someone asked about memory again. And all three of them went and touched something, a jewelry, so a ring, a necklace. And they said, this belonged to my grandmother, this belonged to my great-grandmother. And what that brought out was a lot of discussion, especially the women in the room, not about desire and about shame, not about being shamed for being migrants, for being different. They were not all Italian Americans, by the way. The woman who struck a chord was a young Asian American who said, I carry shame for not having kept enough of a link to my heritage, to that culture. Now, that to me is the other thing that we are negotiating here. How to think about diversity, how to think about going beyond those stereotypes, but again, without victimizing or shaming anyone for what they do or do not carry. How do we imagine forward instead of always imagining backward?
So much, Loredana. The expansion of imagination was something that struck me very much as well because of some things that I was talking about with my students today, actually. We were talking about the difficulty of the city governments to embrace migrants who were trying to come in during when Salvini had closed the ports, right? So a city like Palermo that said, no, our ports are open. Okay, but how does that work when the nation is the one that is really setting the laws and structuring everything, right? And so ultimately we were reading some pieces that were like, yeah, no, it didn't really work. Like it fizzled out. These kinds of, city initiatives. And so the question that I posed to my students was, okay, well then what is the point of doing something like that, of making a declaration of open ports as a city, even if it's something that's difficult to enforce if the nation has closed the ports, right? And really what we kind of landed on as a class was this question of possibilities, expanding possibilities, the potential to move the needle by presenting a different possibility. I think the question remains is, how do you tell when the needle has been moved? What does it mean to move the needle? That's still a big question, I think. Zoe, that's kind of part of what you're getting at in the question that you ask in the last bit of the last clip of the first episode, right? Where it's like, well, so what do we do? What does it mean to move the needle? I will say, another thing that came to mind for me within the academic Italian space relating to what both Kristal and Loredana were talking about. I remember a first round job interview, which I did not get invited for a final round because I was asked, how do you teach Italian? And I was very much talking about, I try to expand the image of Italy that I present to my students. And one of the other professors in this interview said to me, well, what is the point of doing that? Because you have to be able to sell it to the students for enrollment purposes. I was like, oh, okay. But I do think that this is a mentality that we're struggling with in Italian departments. There are kind of logistics of the university that are also at play here, right? We are always stressed about our enrollments constantly. And so then it's easy to sell the seductive idea of Italy. Don't you want to study abroad? Don't you want to go eat pasta and drink spritz all day? That's a very nice image to sell. But how can we complicate that? I do think that there is a benefit to complicating that, but we do work in the US within a very kind of a system that encourages us to perhaps exploit certain ideas of Italy and Italianness. So that was another thing that was on my mind. But something that I love about the podcast and about both of your work kind of more broadly, and about Loredana's work too, and also Teresa Fiore, who's here in the room, is the bridging of immigration to Italy and emigration from Italy, right? Thinking about these phenomena together is very important, I think, and it's not never done, but I think there are maybe more productive connections that we could be drawing, and I think in a lot of ways, your guests, the people who you invite on the podcast, the work that you do, the things that you cite in your study guides and things like the accompanying guides to the episodes, they really try to do that work of thinking more broadly about diasporas to Italy and diasporas from Italy, and how we can put these diasporas in conversation as diasporas. So that's something that I really also think is an expansion of imagination. At the same time, there's always the challenge, which I think you're also actively negotiating in this podcast space, is how do we draw connections without flattening differences? Another thing I was talking about with my students today, right? What do we do when we're drawing historical connections that are really productive in a lot of ways, but it's not the same, right? We can't say it's a one-to-one. Questions of racism in the US, racism in Italy, racialization in the US, racialization in Italy. It's not a one-to-one. So attuning people to the connections, but then also the nuances of the differences in each of these contexts, I think, is something that it seems to me that you're both invested in doing, and that I see coming out in your work. Also with an attention to kind of historical processes, right? So I think part of one of the things that I wanted to ask you all to kind of kick off some of my questions is thinking about the fact that you're doing this in a public-facing forum, right? This is not meant, it can be used in the academic context. It's not meant exclusively for the academic context, right? But a lot of the moves that you're doing, the intellectual moves that you're doing, right, of like making connections, but also being careful to nuance those connections. I mean, those are things that we struggle with as academics, that we're working through as academics. What does it mean to work these topics out in a public forum with speaking to both academics and non-academics? Something that I want to kind of throw to you two.
Isabella. So, okay, I have my notes, but there's a lot here. I do want to, and this is all, è tutto collegato. But I do want to I want to say something about imagination, which is, in order to have imagination, there has to be a sense of freedom. And in thinking of your students in that first exercise, in not, coming up with a story where this was an American student abroad or whatnot, I do wonder, and I have no answer for this, but I wonder if there's a lack of imagination there because they think there's a right answer. And the freedom comes with, you could do whatever you want. And so we do have the freedom to kind of do whatever we want. We don't work in academia. We have creative backgrounds. We're multidisciplinary creatives. I write. I'm a graphic designer by trade. Zoe, video maker, video editor. And so we created what we wanted to create and what we see. So the fact that our approach is intersectional, that means that we invite the people we think could, for the episode, we invite the people we think can come up with a good conversation, of course, but they're all affected by the subject at hand in different ways. And all we did was put them together in a room and start a question, and then they just started talking about their experiences. And so that's I think that's important to note. And also, as far as enrollment, and that comes with the freedom, we could talk about Italian culture because we live it, and we can portray it however we see fit or however we see it with our own eyes. This is how we see it. Like the people, they're just different. Everyone's different. Everyone has their own experience. So there's really you can't control that, and that's what we're doing. We're not controlling anything. And as far as enrollment, for example, who really knows what gets people to sign up to Italian classes, right? Because maybe there's not a lot of Black students, right, that sign up to Italian classes. But if they knew that in our everyday, there are Afro-Italian creatives, fashion designers, and so on and so forth, chefs, right? Maybe if they knew this is a reality in Italy, they would sign up. Because then they look forward maybe to going to Italy to see these people. And so it's what we're doing with our learning materials, with the e-learning space, is trying to represent with an intersectional approach quotidianità every day, right? So it's and the beauty of it is that it never ends. There's always something to connect to what a question that you start off with, and then it never ends. So there could be an experience among Italian Americans, but then Italian Canadians have the same experience but different. And all you have to do is ask that person, and you'll have all these nuances, and they'll just come to light. And if you want to think about it as far, so all we can do really is create. We create, and we want to have these stories told by these people, whoever can talk about their experiences. And then you could think of it as material, data. This is at your disposal. You could do what you want with this material. We can't control that, right? So when I created Accento, when I think, and Zoe could speak to this, but I'm sure that when she created Unlearn, she probably wasn't thinking about academia. I mean, she was just thinking about something that just needed to be done, conversations that needed to be had. And then again, it's an organic approach. Academia, an opportunity for an e-learning space just happened. And so we started working on that. And then we realized, if we want to talk about things, there are plenty of professors who do a lot of research. Why don't we read academic papers? And then we realize all of this information is so important, but only academics read them. So then it could be as simple as having a platform that we have, creating an e-learning space, talking about a topic, but with different experiences, from different people. And I mean, it could be anything. It could be art, it could be graffiti, it could be a quote, it could be a sentence, it could be anything. And then maybe we could have a PDF of an academic paper that's free for download. And then someone will read it because it's like just 2 pages. And they learn from that. And they know there's a research or someone's actually interested in that. And then if the whole goal for us is kind of to apply it to the everyday. And that is hard in a way. And when I say there's a lack of imagination, really, it's here. It's happening. It's just that people can't see. I'm here right now. I'm an Afro-Italian. I'm here. So you can see me. It's just really accepting that there is otherness. And what I realize also, it's also the worlds are kind of, the thought process is really polarized in the sense that when you see otherness, you think of it being different, or maybe then there's an opposite side where it's maybe a humanitarian crisis, right? But there's an in-between, which is normalcy. There's an in-between where it's just people get up, go to work, go to school, and there's just really nothing special about any of it, really. And I think people should start seeing that as well. Because then if you only see the two polarized views, you're always in a state of alert when you see otherness. Because, again, you tie it to these situations. But then when you see that, really, I'm just going to eat a pizza, we're going to beviamo un po' di vino, we're just going to drink some wine or something, hang out, and then go home. When you start seeing that, I do think that you also allow your mind to rest, and you train your mind to accept that this is also a reality. It's just, I hope I answered your question.
Yeah. I wanted to add the fact that identity is not static, is dynamic. And I think I've been also reflecting upon the fact that my privileges are different. And my intention was to create space, to give the mic to the unheard, not the voiceless. And show, like there is Stephanie in the second episode, she said, we have always been a mix, right? So the most diverse DNA in Europe right now is the Italians, right? Who are the Italians? Italy is a brand. It's something that happened a little later on, trying to combine so many cultures and little tribes. Like I was talking with this guy from Poland. He was telling me about the tribalism of Italy, and I was like, "Yeah, I agree. That's totally like what Italy is." I mean, under that flag, under that name, people try to feel some sort of representation, right? That's why Italian Americans here sometimes they want to connect to Columbus, but they don't want to like also maybe kind of recognize how toxic that representation is. But what they don't have anything else. Sometimes it's just glamorizing mafia movies and what else, like restaurants, So people are looking for representation, recognize themselves. But being a mix is also like, I can recognize myself with so many things. And Italians have been using this kind of thing when they need it. Sometimes they are mixed, sometimes, we are not these people. Because they don't consider themselves white, but they don't consider themselves black. So, they try to play in between when they, it depends when it's convenient. And so even for me, it was like, I was not considering myself a white person. And then, my friends were like, you are white, you have to understand that. And I was like, what that means? That means like when the cops stop us, they're gonna profile you as a white person. And, it took a while to understand that, but I wanna say that there is this huge wall between academia and the creatives and street cultures, because also the academia has been not putting themselves in the front. Like sometimes people speak, but they don't put their own experience, and they kind of like talk in abstraction. Like you're a human, you're talking. So who you are, where is your position in society? Sometimes they elevate themselves above. And then the elitism, they kind of like create the gap. Because all I learned about Black culture in America was through hip-hop. Hip-hop has been a genre that now, yes, maybe is in the radio, but was discriminated. In Italy, it was hardly discriminated, which I always didn't understand why, because I was like, could be so Italian. It's poetry, it's literature, it's improvisation. dialect, slang. Like, how come you guys don't recognize yourselves in this amazing subculture? But still to these days, people think that this is an American thing. We don't have anything to do with it. How can you see yourself mocking an American? You know, you're not black. That's, some people would tell me stuff like that. But I think, yeah, like even being an Italian woman in Italy was hard because I was not that kind of stereotypical. And even here, the community, the Italian community, tend to connect to those traditional way of being an Italian, and I don't belong. So I feel like what we create is also something that relate with the urgency, and it's something that I feel. It's also sometimes like, okay, you can talk about a lot of topics and a lot of issues, but what is really urgent, you know? And the racism is something that is very urgent and is interconnected with the sexism, is interconnected with classism. So sometimes I feel we get lost, but we don't understand that all those things are overlapping. And they're overlapping in the Italian context and in the diaspora as well. So I feel we can come together if we put ourselves also in the conversation that we are trying to create or educate others, like, you know, who we are as humans before of being a professor, you know, in terms of, yeah.
Do you want me to respond to that?
Do you have anything to say, Loredana, about it?
As a professor. No, I think there is an image of academia which is, to an extent, like that, you know, the sort of ivory tower thing. Okay, I was in Pittsburgh recently, and I was laughing with another young colleague who was saying, you know, all this talk about ivory tower. And now, if you've been to Pittsburgh University, you know they have a big tower. So it's like, and now I do work in one, actually teach in one. Okay. No, but I think there is, you know, there are conventions and there are rules, and we are sort of part of, you know, we're part of the machine in that sense, and it takes some time to find your voice in any mode. It takes some time to find your voice as an artist. It takes some time to find your voice as an academic. But certainly, at least, you know, for quite a while, I would say feminist scholars, and after that, post-colonial scholars, and now intersectional scholars of all kinds have taught us that positionality is fundamental, you know, and so you always situate yourself, and you always put yourself there, actually. And if you don't do that, you're not achieving. There's a myth of objectivity, neutrality, and truth, and all those things. And we know that actually you should be worrying when people claim universality, not when they claim to speak from a position. If they claim to speak from a position and they're open about their position, I worry a lot less. So I'm with you on that one. But I think that is something that is coming through. In terms of how we write and what we write and in what venues we write, that gets more complicated. There are systems that discipline us. You know, you want to be Foucauldian, we are disciplined in so many ways. I think that's where I enjoy my little bit of freedom. I've got to an age and to a stage in which if I decide that instead of writing a monograph, I want to write a lot of stuff and I want to be here instead of, you know, doing something different, I have some freedom that allows me to do that. I hereby promise to use it as, you know, as much as I can and to be as bad as I can.
So I want to open up some questions to the audience now. And I don't know if our students are back there. They'll come in if they'll figure it out. But any questions from the? Okay, great. I got you.
Thank you. Grazie per tutto. It was a really great conversation, I thought. Just throughout the conversation, I keep thinking that the idea of Italianness and whiteness in Italy is such a kind of squishy concept. As Zoe said very, very well, I think it's like a brand, and I had never thought of it like that, but I think that's really a good way of putting it. So I just a quick backstory. I grew up in the most Italian American state, which is Rhode Island, and so like maybe half my friends were Italian American, and and then I studied abroad in Florence, and I learned a lot of things. I never knew that there was like blonde hair, blue-eyed Italians. Basically, it was something. Of course that's an ignorant thing, but. I had this concept of Italianness and what that meant. And I think, frankly, I thought it was somewhere kind of between kind of the Anglo-whiteness I had grown up with and, because I'm also half Anglo-American, and something that's non-white, right? And so my question is sort of, how do Italians make sense of the regional kind of variations and the different cultures within Italy? And then, of course, you've lived in both of you have lived in Italy and the U.S. So I'm curious how that has changed as you come to the U.S. And then just a point about Christopher Columbus, because I have to. Something I always found kind of puzzling too is that Italian Americans, who are largely descended from Southerners, not completely, but I think it's the majority. That they kind of uplift this figure who was from Bologna, or from Genoa, sorry, he's from the north. And I mean, I'm sure that there wouldn't have been that similar solidarity back in the day between a northern merchant and, these, and then a lot of these people who come to the US are like Southern descended. So it's like, I just am always confused as to how, like you said, the brand is constructed, basically. So.
Well, I mean, like Kristal in the first episode, actually, she was talking about the sense of competition, which is something that Italians really enjoy. So, yeah, the regional differences, it becomes like a claim of, I'm from this part, we talk differently, we cook differently, and I'm proud of it. So basically, people are very, they want to stick with the stereotypes sometimes because it's like representation again. And the sound of how we talk is gonna right away tell where we are actually from, because even if we don't speak dialect, we carry the accent. So you can understand right away between Italians, of course, if that person is from the north or from the south. Maybe you don't get exactly the region, but you get that almost right away. So, and I think people are very like, oh, that's a prestige, like, oh, I'm from this, from that. So it's like a matter of manners, way to be, passions, so many things. But also, again, I'm sure that a lot of Italians, they are from the same exactly city. They would tell, oh, I don't think like you. No, I don't think what you're saying right now, I don't know. That doesn't represent me. So in the culture, there are differences. And some people like to belong to a group. Some other people love their individuality and they want to be, truly themselves. So they seek for authenticity. And yeah, so it's beautiful to see that, because you see more diversity when you see people that stick to their individuality and they don't want necessarily, because traditions are beautiful, but there are so many that we don't know as well. It's like almost like history, there is so much that we don't know. So it seems like, oh, that's the real history. I'm like, maybe you don't know about this little civilization. You don't know about this dialect that was before the ones that they speak now. We don't know the tradition of how they cook this. But so it depends on what is taught as well. And, the grandmothers, what they carry, what they say. It's also true that so much of the popular wisdom, like, I don't know, saggezza popolare, which is like, what we carry, what our ancestors were about, what they were standing, like the rituals. All of those things has been really wiped out by, Catholicism. So Italians kind of lost a lot of their identity because of that. And also that's hard to admit because some people, they're Catholic and they don't want to admit it. So it's also like, all right, well then, it's okay. Jesus is all about love, but also we know what we have done, so we've been colonized as well, in a way. We lost our way of being indigenous. But that's what Italy is beautiful and famous for. Like, because we love the nature, the way we cook, the way, the attention we spend in doing all those things that take time. So that's the beauty of Italy. So sometimes it's just like, okay, make up with your mind what you want to be, But you can be both, maybe. You can be all those things. And about, what else was it?
I'm curious about what part of the question that you asked here is, how does your kind of sense of your regional identity as well change when moving to a U.S. context, right? I think it's a good kind of thing to think about.
I'll try to answer this one, but I'm probably not, I'm a very chill person, so I really am like everyone's who they are. I don't understand why there's conflict most of the time, but and I grew up in Udine. I wouldn't definitely someone I wouldn't and I grew up in Udine. I wouldn't say I'm Friulana. I'm sure, I don't speak the dialect. I understand it. So I'm probably not the best person to answer that question. But I do know that when you go to the U.S., you really don't care about regionality anymore. You just care about who's Italian. You just try to talk to any Italian that's out there, and you become best of friends. So all of the conflict actually disappears. No one cares if you're from Naples anymore. And maybe you're like from Milano or someone like up north, and then you meet someone who's from Naples, and all that friction that was existed when you were in Italy just disappears because you're looking for connection and you're looking for someone to be your friend and you're looking for something in common, and everything's okay all of a sudden. So so I wasn't looking for anyone friulano, really. But what happened was I just noticed that things were different, and so you do kind of look for authenticity all of a sudden that I didn't know I had in me. And so I was like, well, that's not Italian. That's not an Italian dish. So, but then again, doing Accento, I understood that, no, that's an Italian-American dish, and it's fine. Nothing's going to happen to my nonna's recipes. Like, nothing's going to happen. But, so was that the answer? Did that answer the question a little bit?
Great. We have a question.
Yes.
I would very much like to respond. My family comes from Italy, comes from Reggio Calabria. My father never spoke English. My mother did. And I spoke the dialect. My father felt at home more here on Arthur Avenue than in Italy. Now, when I went to Italy in 1970, I did not understand why when we went to Rome, which was, Mamma Mia, we're going to Rome, my aunt, my father was the third of 18 children. My aunt came with us, and we stayed in a tiny little rinky-dink. I was used to Howard Johnson's, New York. A rinky-dink little hotel on the outskirts. We did not go to a restaurant. We ate at zupezzata in the room because we are Calabrese. We don't want anyone to know that. It was very real. The discrimination was very real. Even at the train station, the way you speak, the handlers were probably Sicilian and Calabrese, and the way they treated people, and I didn't understand this. I was young. I didn't understand this. Then I come back to America, and of course my father never discussed this. I come back to America, and I was a designer. I worked in the field. But before, when I graduated, I was sent to Gucci, right on when they were on Fifth Avenue. Again, not understanding anything. The guy saw my name, and he said to me, "You're Italian?" I said, "Yes, even though I'm born here, I am." And he started asking me about where I come from. The minute I said, my family comes from Reggio Calabria, I never got called back. I didn't understand it. I did not understand it.
Yeah.
Okay? This is in 1974. This was in 74.
Yeah.
Then I came here, and I got my master's in film here, and I focused on Lena Wertmuller because it's all there. I really learned a lot from the Wertmuller movies. But then I went into the medical field, and I will tell you how many Italian doctors I worked with. Everyone's from Bergamo.
Yeah.
Everyone's from Tuscany. Everyone's from Piemonte. And
yes. No. This is just for the sake of time.
Okay,
yeah.
I'll say one thing.
Okay.
They would say to me, take me aside and say, Anna Maria, ven. Don't say anything to anyone. My mother and father from Bari.
Yes, right. Of course. Yes. That's. So I'm going to give you the mic. Do you want to respond?
Very real.
Because I want to talk about colorism. And, when I discovered this word in United States, I was like, oh, wow. Why nobody say this in Italy? Because this is exactly the word that describes the problem between North and South. And there is a huge discrimination, for sure, that's been, ongoing for so long. And United States, especially New York, there is a lot of people from the South and, Naples, Sicily. But there are people in Argentina, Uruguay, Brazil that are also from the North. Yeah.
Though I think, the kind of, again, when we get to the question of continuity and disruption, it's really important, right? Because colorism, in some ways it works, in some ways it really doesn't, right? Because we're so actually very kind of very diverse in our outward appearances in the Italian context. So not everybody from the South is particularly dark. And so then how do we kind of, it's always the big question, I think, that we face when we're talking about discrimination within Italy, especially anti-Southern sentiment.
And if I can say a couple of things that have been raised. So, again, what you were saying, culture is always dynamic. So it changes. It changes from locality to locality. It changes from time to time, and our experiences will always be positioned in certain ways. Historically, we know that many Italians discovered their Italianità by leaving Italy. Historically, it's also the case that, for instance, here in the United States, for a long time, communities identified with a paese, with a region, so you would find churches, you would find support associations that would identify with those localities. Now, as we move, yes, maybe more and more, we may be saying, okay, I don't care, if you're from Udine or if you're from wherever. But then again, that's where intersectionality comes in. Maybe there are other things that make us feel more similar or not. all university students on an Erasmus course across Europe, or are we whatever? So there are always these elements that create senses of solidarity and senses of diversity and distinction. So what divides and what unifies changes over time, and I think that's important. I just wanted to say one thing very quickly, because honestly that would take a whole other evening, and it's taken days of work. But to address what you were saying on Columbus, the thing to remember is that the Columbus controversy is a United States controversy. It's not an Italian controversy. Columbus in Italy, yes, is a known entity historically, and yes, there are squares and there, but he can't even begin to compete with Garibaldi, for instance, okay? I'm putting it jokingly, but what I'm saying is it's a controversy that was largely built here. And when the Italians arrived here, when the migrants arrived here, they found Columbus already being idolized here, and it was their way up. I can't go into the details of that, but I can give you the bibliography if you want. But it is, it's an American contestation, by which I'm not diminishing it. That's not my intention at all, is to say it's not what Italians think about Columbus, if by that we mean Italians in Italy. What Italians think about Columbus here is very much related to American history and to their positioning in that American history. What you were saying earlier, for instance, about the question of whiteness, the question of contested whiteness, the question of social positioning, it's very much part of that. Not that Columbus doesn't exist in Italy, and of course, historically, who Columbus was, what he did, his role in, that is all. But the Columbus controversy as such is specific to this history.
So we're going to have to actually wrap just because we're at time, and we've got to let our Casa crew go home. Thank you to the students who are helping us here facilitate, and also thank you to Julian Sachs back in the booth for AV. And so any questions that you have, you can definitely come up here and ask our panelists. And I want to give a big thank you to Zoe and Kristal and Loredana.